Okay. So I attended as many of the roundtables I could, and it was quite interesting to hear, for example, Sharon say that preparing for this had made her revisit the work, and that's exactly what I did. And like her, I still like the chapter, but I can see the amount of work that was left to be done. So today I'm just going to tell you about the part that is very pedagogical, so the analysis of my students' work and how that went back into pedagogy to help them address the issues they had with the task. But then I'll just kind of expand it a little bit, like I did in the chapter, to trying to understand where does the influence come from in our students' understanding of critical thinking. We often tend to stay at the disciplinary level. Are they doing it like their discipline has taught them how to do it? But in the context of Singapore, it was quite specific, really, and that's why I was interested in looking beyond the discipline to understand what shaped their understanding. Okay, so first, the context is it's a content-based writing module that I taught at the National University of Singapore. You can consult the chapters in the book that Mark Brooke edited on this. It was all about that suite of modules that were credit-bearing for language, but that were content-based. So we did that was one of the discussion. We did half content and half literacy. Students were from all across the campus. So that's obviously very important. They came in with their own disciplinary background. This is a type of content we looked at. So the module was color semiotics. We looked at a bit of theory on color. We mostly looked at social semiotics approach to meanings of color in the social world. We looked a bit at practice, and students worked first on a reflective summary response. And then they put together a small research project that meant they investigated color meaning around anything they wanted to in their context in Singapore, sometimes in their discipline, but most broadly around social issues or issues of identity, or quite a few wrote about gender and race and so on. Okay, so today I'm showing you about this reflective summary response, which was the first assignment they did. And that was across all the modules. So we had that kind of assessment structure that was exactly the same. So in my module, this is what they had to do. I changed the paper regularly, of course, but I did the study based on this one. So they had to critically respond to an article, which meant they had to summarize it or summarize key points and then engage with one of the themes. So we're going to have a look at this one, so Pretty in Pink. This is a paper that discredits the notion that preference for colors, especially for pink, are innate and biologically driven. So do women or girls like pink because, in the old days, berries were red, and so biologically we've evolved. So evolutionary biology still kind of holds that kind of beliefs. So this study, and there are many others that discredit that hypothesis, and basically measured children's preference for color. So up until 3, preference across genders is for bright colors, primary colors, highly saturated. Around 3 changes, girls adore pink, boys like blue and hate pink. And so you've got that kind of thing happening throughout their childhood. Around 9, 10 years old, girls reject pink. Anyone here who has a daughter will know that phase. So their hypothesis then is that this is not linked to biology, it's linked to socialization into gender norms. And because it's at 3 years old, it comes right at the same time as the beginning of schooling. So basically, they explain, well, when you find out about gender at school mostly, you ask yourself, well, what is a girl? And the best you find is, well, girls like pink, so I guess so do I. So there's a whole study that goes into that. So students can engage in a lot of different ways with this, right? They're likely to make judgments about some of those knowledge claims, about the different debates that are mapped out in the paper. They'll evaluate the source claim, the claims then. They might reflect on the results. They might reflect on the explanation. Is it schooling? Is it something else? And they might also relate to more introspective experiences with their own evolution with the color preference. So there's a huge amount of possibilities to engage with the paper. And I found myself constantly saying, as I gave feedback or as I gave them some pointers, critical thinking and reflecting on those ideas is not your ability to criticize. It's not about finding ways to disagree. It's not about dismissing or even insulting. But those kind of issues with students kept coming up. So I just thought, okay, I'll just go a little bit deeper, because just saying that doesn't work. It's not reaching them. I thought it would, but it's not. So I did this fairly small study where I basically asked how do they respond, and what is it that makes it different, the high and low achievement bands, and what does that tell us about their understanding of what constitutes valued critical reflection in this module. So the methodology, I did a text analysis student script. I had 24 students ranging from excellent to much weaker. And I used axiological cosmologies to do this. So I have a few quotes here or from Carl, which kind of, in a little nutshell, tell you about cosmology. So those belief systems that underlie practices constitute a vision of the world, which are embodied within the activities. So when I look at what students do in their text, I can go back to much broader worldviews that they might hold. It's a way to signal their affiliations. So here for us, it could be affiliation to their disciplines. Maybe their understanding comes from there. Those alignments are more or less conscious. And again, it's about that affiliation and thinking this is the way, this is the correct way to do critical thinking. Oh, sorry, that should be cluster with an L. I saw that. Oh, I wish not having my glasses avoided me not noticing my typos. But so within cosmologies, the way to build it towards them is to look at the smallest kind of items in a text, which is when you put together the target of an evaluation with the evaluation. So this, Namala and Esther have looked at and called clusters. And when those are recurrent across a text and several texts, then you start seeing constellations. So around different key targets and then different kind of alignments of evaluations around these. So those patterns of evaluations, you can then see whether they align or disalign, either with the expectations of the task or with the disciplinary values the students are bringing in, or maybe broader. Okay, so here you have an attitudinal cluster evaluation and the target with an example from the text, the target and limited. To continue with the analysis, and I'll go back to this in more detail, but I simplified appraisal, so just to look at the linguistic items and see how they then formed those constellations. I had a look at engagement, which is using sources from in the literature and integrating them into your work. And I really, really simplified that into endorse or distance. and then judgments, affect, or opinion. So emotions or opinions about research, about things. And this is the coding table that I used. We can go back to this a bit later if you want. All right, so what were students doing? Very broad things that I noticed before was they don't target the same thing. Some of them look at the field of study, and some of them look at the field of research. And the difference is the methodology or the content. Are they looking at the knowledge claims, or are they looking at the methodology of the study? They use different types of appreciations and judgments, and they relate it to those sources very differently as well. So I'm going to look at the low achieving students, and that's mainly about the attitude and the opinions. And then we'll look at the high achieving, and that's more about engaging with the literature. So they tended to engage with the field of research. So their critical thinking deployment in a text was, I want to judge the validity of the knowledge through my evaluation of the methodology. So the targets were things like experiment methods findings, and then quite often then the evaluation was quite negative. So the charging on those clusters was negative, and you have several examples there. Within the field of research, methods and also results, right? So sometimes you have something that might seem positive, but because it was in a concessive clause, so while the author's findings seem convincing, then it carries on with something a lot more negative. Some of them were extremely harsh as well, in a way that is not warranted in most cases, but certainly not when you have an undergrad student engaging with peer-reviewed published literature. The difference is so vast, in terms of experience and knowledge, that it's always a little bit strange to have a student more or less, thrashing a methodology like this. So over several of those texts, you have those kind of constellations building, where the authors are incompetent, the methods are ill-designed, the results are invalid, skewed. And so those kind of negative constellations were built. But really, quite strikingly, you could write this without even touching the actual knowledge claim of the content. So what I told you about this idea of children engaging with a color preference, you could completely write that assignment without even touching that. Because once you've invalidated the method, you're kind of, you can get out from engaging with the content. So this what really stayed in me, that the idea of students thinking that critical thinking is about evaluating knowledge validity. And the way to evaluate knowledge validity is through the methodology. Is the methodology accurate? And so this, yes, please, Scott.
So I'm just wondering about that. Might that be partly because they've been given a research paper and somehow they've got a methodology of what you're asking them to do is be a reviewer, be a peer reviewer of the paper, and so they've got a version of that, of what they believe it's all about.
Yes. So yeah, Paul, that's one of the possibilities. The paper is an empirical paper, so it has all that vocabulary. So yes, that is one possibility, but it's still telling us, right, that the way they see their relation with the text is at that level, and it's not what is expected of the task. And so, of course, that's my job to kind of explain to them that's not what we want. So there are different reasons where it could be disciplinary, and I know that in some disciplines that is the engagement with the text is a methodological review or critique, right? But it's not all the types of engagement we can have with the text. So yes, I exactly had those kind of thoughts when I was reading this. There's also the context of Singapore that I will tell you about afterwards, but definitely the idea of positivist type of interaction with the text. So high achievement, a completely different angle. The targets of evaluation were mostly the field of study. So they engaged straight away with color semiotics. So, is it true that it is that it can't be biological? And drew in some very convincing kind of research in this. Is it true that it has to be the schooling that does that? Isn't it something much broader, etc., etc.? So there was a lot of engagement there, both positive or negative, right? So it's not about agreeing with, right, at all, but it is the type of targets. They used minimal judgments there, but they used a lot of engagement resources. So they did do their evaluation, but it wasn't through this is good, this is competent, this is reliable. It wasn't that type of resource for showing their alignment with the or disalignment. Oops. Okay. So here for this, I used Jaegen's paper where he used engagements into engagement from SFL, but looking at the way students are aligning or disaligning with sources. And so that was a very useful concept here to have a look at the evaluation that they assign to those different positions. And so in order to look at alignment and disalignment, I used engagement, but again, very, very simplified. It was either endorse, so aligning with, or distancing. And using Jaegen's paper, I put alignment as being a positive evaluation and disalignment as being a negative charging, right? So that created a new type of cluster using engagement. So the position, and then are we aligning, are we disaligning? So I'm going to show you some samples. What's underlined is the position. What's in italics is the indication of the alignment. Right, so we get things like this sentence 8 here was the actual thesis statement from the student. So the student was saying, yes, it's true that the two notions of gender identification and color preference are closely intertwined, which was a hypothesis of the original paper. And you can see that they're putting substantial evidence there prominently, and that they then go into the literature to find supplementary support for this link between those two notions. Okay, so we have a lot of endorsing as well, but again, it's not that idea that is not what makes the student achieve the assignment's expectations. The fact that they agree with the paper, they could equally find a very convincing literature that that is not that aligned. So they could have gone into evolutionary biology and found some fairly convincing things. So it's not about the student themselves aligning, but it's how they engage with that original paper. So you have it here in a table form. So these are the positions. So the targets become those positions. The field of study. So you did have that, the experiment, the positions. Right. Sorry. So in the field of study, we had the results and the positions advanced in the results section, so that there is no gendered color preference in infancy, and that gendered color preference begins at 2 to 3 years old. Right, so you then had use of the literature to align with this. A next cluster was a field of study, but this one, a position being advanced in the discussion. So in the discussion, the authors were writing their hypothesis. Is it because of schooling mostly, but can it be about broader environment, etc.? So they aligned with this. Some students then disaligned at that stage and went into finding broader environmental factors that have influenced those color preferences. And then that's what you had here, position being advanced by the student as a development of a discussion point. And that was really hitting all the marks to actually come up with, well, maybe as I've read, it could also be this. And in that case, the student was saying, well, maybe boys are more susceptible to social pressure. And so they were able to then link it to one of the points of discussion in the original paper. So here you found this time a positively charged constellation about, but what's important, it was that. It could be a negatively charged one, but it was about the field of study, right? And those different targets that the students evaluated and engaged with. These, because the text was quite short, the assignment, once they focused on this, they usually didn't focus on the methodology at all. So recap for the pedagogical side of things. So those attitudinal and engagement resources show very different orientations to the texts. They helped me clarify the basis of achievement in much more detailed manner. As I said, I was telling them, come on, critical thinking is not about this, but I didn't have enough evidence to help them with the understanding for that message to be driven home. So I was able to then really tell them, this is what you're expected to do. You're not expected to tell me whether the methodology is, unless there is there is something very, very prominent. But I told them, but it's not the point. So I'm hardly going to select a paper where you would have to really focus on the methodology. And so the idea that that students clearly had a different conception of what it meant to critically engage. I'll tell you about I can tell you now, actually, there's a slide at the end, but the intervention that I derived from that was, first, we did some text analysis in class, where I just asked them what's the target and what is the evaluation and how is the student engaging with that text, so they could actually see it, right? And they could go back to their draft and see whether they were maybe on the wrong track. And then we discussed it as well. So we discussed what's coming up next in this talk. Where does your understanding of critical thinking come from, do you think? Is it your discipline, or is it something else? And that also generated a lot of interesting conversation. Okay, so the next step for me was why. And I think this was quite kind of a convergence of many things, because being in Singapore, I don't know, Dan, if you will agree, but being in Singapore meant I was a bit of a fish out of water. So things that were normal for others weren't normal for me. So I feel the same in the UK, I must say. But anyway, so I could see things a bit maybe more than I would if I had always grown, if I'd grown up in this place, and that things were basically completely assumed. So that was one thing, having a sort of an external eye on something just, probably made me more attuned to wanting to find out why. And there's the three things, if you put those three citations together, they kind of defend the next weird research that's coming up. Something that could really be taken as a complete conjecture, making, just conjectures. But if you are looking at the fact that a text is a representation of practices, I really like this too from Bourdieu and from Carl there. The idea that the whole social structure is present in each interaction. And what Bourdieu says here is that the concern to return to the things themselves and to get a firmer grip on reality, a concern which often inspires the project of micro-sociology, can lead one purely and simply to miss a reality that does not yield to immediate intuition because it lies in structures transcending interaction which they inform. So what I understand from that is that, okay, so the people who don't like critical discourse analysis are not going to like me there, but it's not because it's not obvious in the text that it's not there. That's what I read from this. So maybe the structures that are influencing what's happening in a text are not, you can't really grab them so easily in the text.
I think that's a really important aspect of the sort of sociology that LCT is, and Bourdieu and Bernstein, which is the notion that we have to go beyond what Bourdieu called spontaneous sociology, which is this sort of notion that you can just look at stuff, very empiricist sort of thing. So Bourdieu often called it realist, but he was using the wrong word there. He was just using the French tradition. So what he meant was empiricist, that kind of empiricist description, and the only things that are there are perceivable and so on, which is just ridiculous because there's what you've got is society and all sorts of structures. What LCT would call it organizing principles, and Bernstein would call it, which create legitimation codes. Bernstein would call it regulative discourse, but I won't get into that because that's probably the most misunderstood concept he's ever had. People are always, I've seen PhDs submitted that say that that's to do with classroom management, which it's not. That is the cosmology that's being expressed through practices. And as I said, Bourdieu, LCT, Bernstein, all of them are trying to say that there's sort of, like Bernstein said, sorry, I just interrupted because I just wanted to sort of emphasize, I think this is really important. Bernstein said that the way in which curriculum is put together reflects what we would call a cosmology, which is the thing that Mary Douglas put it nicely. She said, when you've forgotten all the content, what you will still remember without realizing is the way in which things are put together. So it's not the content of learning science, maths, or whatever, which is why people are always saying, why do I learn this? I'm never going to use differential equations. Or why do I learn that? Why do I learn the other? That's not the thing that shapes your brain. The thing that shapes your brain is the way those things are put together, which is like classification and framing, or in LCT, it's all the organizing principles, semantic gravity, density, and all that sort of stuff, or the codes. Bourdieu doesn't really have the concepts to analyze those principles, but he's pointing to the same thing, the cosmology. And it's not just evident in what's being talked about.
No, yes. Yeah. But I mean, that links, I think, the way I understand it is, it links to what's leveled against discourse analysis, critical discourse analysis as well, that you can't, okay, well, maybe I won't get into that because maybe that'll come up in questions. But I did always have that idea that, are you just, making it up? What is there? So that is where cosmology is.
Sorry to interrupt you again, Laetitia. I just want to ask you, were you worried that it was feeling a bit interpretive, a bit hermeneutic, a bit kind of, I'm projecting this in as an interpretation?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I mean, maybe some of you will think it is, but we'll see. So anyway, all practices reflect cosmology as well, right? So even if it's not visibly something that empirically you would be able to measure, but I'm going to show you what happens then. So the students are possibly aligning with a variety of discourses, cosmologies around critical thinking. But which one? Is it the home discipline? Is it the choice of paper? Paul, you were saying that. So home discipline, no, there was no evidence at all from the sample. In fact, the top performing were all, and the weakest performing were all from engineering. So it wasn't that they were bringing in that kind of, this is the way, this is how I've been taught to, not through their discipline. Plus, we have to remember that in many societies, students don't really choose the major they go into. It could be their their parents may have told them, no, I know you want to do philosophy, but you're going into engineering. So we can't really I didn't feel very comfortable making those assumptions. But what I thought I would have some actual more concrete evidence about was the actual broader discourse around critical thinking in Singapore. So obviously, anyone who has contributed to the module and anyone who is involved in critical thinking or writing reflections and so on in education will know that there are very different approaches to it and understanding. Ian Bruce, just in his introductory chapter on critical thinking, was listing these main things. So critical thinking associated with evaluation and construction of arguments, logical analysis, focus on the scientific method as a legitimate knowledge building. Then you've got as a skill, so the ability to evaluate, to solve problems. So that's more to do almost, with building a flexible workforce. Can you solve problems? Can you think out of the box and find solutions? And then as emancipatory, so that approach is about unearthing structural and systemic assumptions. Critical thinking in Singapore. Dan, please, you can jump in anytime. Lionel Lim, is at NIE, and he wrote about critical thinking in Singapore. So critical thinking is everywhere in Singapore, in all the educational documents. It's essential to develop critical thinking. Looking at the main, so this is where I looked at evidence of how critical thinking is represented in Singapore. So I looked at the NIE working paper on creative and critical thinking that informed policy. And so NIE is the Institute of Education, so they are very influential in what happens then in schools and in Singapore. And then I looked at the university, NUS, the general core curriculum document, which also had a large section. One of the pillars were critical thinking. And so what was quite obvious, if you see the kind of examples I've pulled out there, is a human capital ideology in a changing world. So critical thinking is a way to manage to adapt to the changes. So it's presented as a solution to changes, which themselves, that's another story, but which themselves are presented as impossible to avoid, as they're assumed to be happening, like we see with any kind of new, like things like AI and so on, right? So the change, we're not here to discuss the change itself. We're here to discuss how do we adapt to the change. And critical thinking is a way, right? So it's linked in the discourse there to the country's capability to cope with changes. It's linked to a healthy skepticism. Not sure about what we have to be skeptics about, but definitely that was very strong in these documents. It also means that you're going to get a better answer, the right answer. There's a strong focus on value-free and objective knowledge. So what gurus call like rational technicality. It's also linked to an open mind, not defined, to several cognitive processes, the ability to analyze, to synthesize. And there is this interesting sensitivity to context, right, which also leaves quite a broad interpretation open. All right, so this is what students, educators would have seen, right? This representation of critical thinking. So from the previous slide, maybe the first two definitions, certainly not the next one. And so what Lim did was he then went to secondary schools and high schools and looked at how it was taught there. And so for me, it was very interesting because my students were undergrad students, and they've just come out from that system. There are different types of schools, the elite schools and the mainstream schools in Singapore. And so they understand critical thinking slightly differently, which is quite interesting. In the mainstream schools, Lim found that critical thinking is understood as an instrumental skill to get at a right answer, or the right way of getting at the answer, especially in English and humanities. And in social science subjects, the focus was on evaluating knowledge claim credibility. So that goes back to my students wanting to evaluate whether the knowledge claim is credible, but doing it through a critique of the methodology. And then in elite school, a little bit more relaxed. So I don't know, relaxed is not the word, but maybe you understand. So you observe that critical thinking was taught as part of philosophy programs, and the focus was on constructing, evaluating arguments. Okay. In year one in NUS, so to complete that kind of portrait of, where are my students coming from? Where are they getting their ideas about critical thinking? In year one at the university, they all had to take a compulsory quantitative reasoning module. Everyone. There was no qualitative inquiry module as an equivalent. So that was it. So when you put all this together, then you kind of start thinking, well, maybe it's much more than the discipline that is influencing my students. Just wanted to show this about Lim. It's a great quote as well. So he could see that real big contradiction between that instructional discourse that is heavily laden with both neoliberal and liberal aspirations, but within an illiberal regulatory discourse. So it talks about the teaching of critical thinking as one of the most prized skill, but also both the form and the means to esoteric emancipatory knowledge in an authoritarian society. So it's a fantastic, and I only dipped a toe in that, but it is a fantastic thing to study how that balance is created in Singapore. And that's why I noticed it maybe more, because to me it was quite different. And it was a very strange way to think of critical thinking for me. So this is the pedagogical intervention that I put together. So I told you about it, right? We did text analysis of constellations in text. We did discussions about critical thinking and different engagement with the text. We talked about critical thinking in the students' discipline, and then we talked about critical thinking in their schooling experience. And although part of the study could have involved students, telling me about how they understand it, I didn't do that. But I can just quote a student in class, who just said, yeah, I went to poly. I know exactly what you mean. So that kind of, when we were saying about how was critical thinking defined in your school and how about in your school, they knew what Lionel Lim was talking about. They could recognize it. And so then finally, it worked on students' text. They kind of were able to say, okay, no, I'm not engaging with the knowledge claim the way that this assignment is requiring me to do so. So in terms of pedagogy, it was extremely successful to really go in depth, because we all have those, as teachers, we all have that intuitive, and we can see, okay, those students are doing this, but sometimes saying it at the surface level just doesn't work. So going in depth into actually what it is that they are doing helped me show them what I was expecting. And then the second part of the why are they doing this? I think it's obviously a very, very complex enmeshment of influences, right? It could be their discipline. There's a lot going on there, but it would be very interesting continue exploring the way the students mediate those broader discourses, not just a disciplinary discourse, but the practice beyond that, and how that then transpires and influences the way they work on individual texts. Carl and Rainbow, Chen, I thought your paper, the research about Chinese students in Australia was quite similar in the way that you were going much further into trying to explain what it is. And you didn't stop, obviously, at it's because they are Chinese, or it's because you were trying to find things that would be very helpful to them to understand how to achieve the task. So I think I'm done here. I've got some citations there, and I can take any questions or comments.
People, please just jump in.
So I think it says a lot about a couple of things from, being in Singapore myself, and I'm working in a very different context. And so some of the backgrounds is that Laetitia was working at, one of the leading universities. And I know I've had discussions with her before about the quality and the caliber of students that she was often getting in her class as well. But on top of that, just having the foresight and perhaps the team that you were working with to have the autonomy and the agency to kind of be designing these particular types of units. That says a lot, to be able to put those things together. And yeah, just great work.
Thanks, Dan. But you see, that makes me think it's true that within Singapore, NUS was already a little bubble of elite and so on, right? And within NUS, that writing program, again, was just across from Yale NUS. It's almost an experiment into how liberal can we go. It didn't work out very well because Yale is closed down and this program doesn't exist in the same way. So it's what I found really fascinating in Singapore, how, to see where they drew the line, because we weren't in a democratic society. We were in a very highly policed kind of educational system that wanted to give, I don't even want to say an illusion, that wanted to find a kind of a way where it's a very complex and interesting thing. But in the same way that in the elite schools, the critical thinking was a lot more pushing, the critique part of it. It was also just done in the elite school because I suppose, first, Lim explains it very well. He says basically the elite of Singapore don't want their kids. They want their kids to have all the critical thinking open to them, the one that is understood elsewhere in the world. But because they're part of the elite, we trust them, that they won't rock the boat as much as, it might happen elsewhere. So it's that kind of, it's fascinating. To me.
Are you doing more stuff on critical thinking or critical reflection or anything like vaguely homologous to this in your work now?
So no, at the moment, because I've moved to the UK, so for the last 18 months, I've just kind of been getting to grips with things here, and but I think critical thinking here will be and cosmologies will be very interesting to analyze as well, because it feels like it's a 360. It's completely the opposite, and maybe the result is exactly the same. So not yet, but hopefully, definitely looking at the way things are portrayed in broader contexts, like critical thinking or other things, is very interesting. So cosmologies is definitely something I want to continue to look into.
Yeah, particularly in our multinational, diverse classrooms. I haven't done any analysis on my own students, but just from being in the room, the different value systems that lie behind my Australian and similar students to those from other parts of the world. Particularly here, we have a lot of Chinese students, and that's different in a way than it's not the same sort of differences as the ones we were looking at with the Rainbow Chen study all those years ago, which was to do with, just because that was very early. That was before semantics existed, really.
Yeah.
And so it was just looking at the sort of the kind of the knowledge codes they were bringing, and that work could be reanalyzed with semantic codes as well, because they weren't bringing particularly complex knowledge codes. They were bringing very simple knowledge codes of sort of bundles of facts rather abstract conceptual frameworks. But just to look at the knowledge versus the Noah codes here that were very progressive. But I'm talking not of that. I'm talking of the value systems that the students are bringing, particularly when I teach sociology of deviance, which Australians, I think, enroll for because it's got the word deviance in the subject, and they think it'll be fun and kind of a bit risque. And the Chinese students usually are asking me almost all the way through the course how you can eradicate deviance from society, which is a really different sort of it's not just a different question, it's a different value system behind. I mean, even though I teach, even though the fundamental first week is that Durkheim said you can't have society without deviance, because as soon as you set up norms, you immediately set up things that go beyond norms. But even though I do that and I say that every week, I still have the same question: how do you get rid of deviance? Because it's a very different sort of idea of what's positively or negatively charged. In what they're bringing to the classroom.
Yeah. And in EAP, in English for academic purposes, in the UK particularly, it's a very difficult area to look into, because there is also here in this country the discourse that Chinese students can't think, or Chinese students. So there is that kind of awful kind of belittling of a whole population, not acknowledging that they are individuals. So I'm also very conscious that when I talk about like a broader, there's also that risk of being misunderstood, and I don't think it's that at all. It is that we are all growing up with assumptions that, but it doesn't mean that in the end the conclusion would be, oh yeah, well that's why Chinese students can't think. So it's quite it's a bit of a difficult. I don't know, Dan, if you think the same, right? Because you've experienced Australia's kind of EAP field as well.
Same thing.
So it's
Yeah, but people have always said X can't think when they mean X doesn't think like me.
Yeah. Yes. Or I am not making that additional kind of effort to understand what influences my students' way of thinking or engaging. So it's like a massive shortcut to a conclusion that is discriminatory, and so there's something about this that could veer towards that kind of stuff. So you have to be very careful with explaining it very well, and
but we all bring our cosmologies, our dispositions, our set of codes that we're good at or bad at, and
Shall I stop sharing so I can see?
Sure. I think somebody else was going to say something.
I was just going to say was feeling this chimes a bit with the marking I spent the week before last, doing a whole week of marking for master students. And I think an awful lot of them are Chinese background, though I don't know, partly because the lecture I gave only about 20 out of 200 turned up to. So I haven't actually seen them, and I've no idea whether and how they were engaging with the material that exam question was about. But one of the things I put in my feedback was that people weren't engaging with theory in their answers. So, and it feels like this is something similar, that maybe this would be a way, cosmologies would be a way of sort of me getting a better insight into what was going on. But one of the things that I was thinking is they seem to be answering from common sense rather than from what we were teaching.
Yeah.
Or they were answering for possibly from ChatGPT answers that were just things that weren't covered at all on the course. So they were bringing in theory that was not the theory we were examining them on.
Yeah.
So in those cases, it was there, but where it came from, it wasn't from me. And I'm biased in this because they didn't turn up to my lecture. So I've immediately got this bias that you didn't pay any attention, you weren't even there. But I do provide, there's a video they can watch afterwards, and I provide a workbook that is a written version of it. So there's no reason they have to be there to engage with the course material. But it is something related to the critical thinking thing, in the fact the core thing that they weren't doing that I wanted them to do was engage with the theory.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I don't know.
Yeah.
This is the sort of analysis that would help
Yeah.
give me insight into what is going on there.
Because really, as I was doing this, I really did think, this is not anything new. Every teacher around, knows that students tend to engage with methodology, be harsh with it, And so I was saying, are you saying anything new? But what I was concerned about was saying that to the students didn't work. And as Dan said, they were really good students. And so there was something else that it just wasn't enough to just tell them. So as you're saying, it's maybe just not enough to tell them you need to engage with those theories. I think it's the whole package. You have to tell them, when you do this, when you engage with this is what you're doing, and this is not what we're expecting. And the study helps you to basically, lay it out in more details. So the message
I think the two of you have just made really clear the whole point of all this stuff and everything by LCT, really, which is, that it Boys draws on it, as well as its traditions and its foundational frameworks, which is making stuff explicit. We're not claiming to find a new chemical element. We're trying to say this is something that goes on, and to make it, because people used to say to me when I did lots of talks on semantic waves, oh, that's just what good teaching is. And I'm like, yeah, but that's often done intuitively by very few teachers. Trust me, I've been watching thousands of hours of school teaching, and even the good teachers aren't doing it that often. They're not doing it mindfully in many cases, and lots of teachers are not doing it at all. So just saying, oh, we already know that that's what good teaching is. It's like, yeah, but this is just making things explicit so that people can choose to do it and be mindful in doing it. And it's the same way with the students. Like, if we can just make it explicit, then there's a possibility for them to go, oh, right, okay, that's what I'm being asked to do. Because my disposition, they would say if they knew this theory, my dispositions do not, or habitus, if you want Portugal's term, do not have those codes, they would say if they had the theory. So please make them explicit to me,
Laetitia, or anyone, do you ever think about a way of finding out about how your students actually think and engage with these? Because right now, what I'm facing is that in most of my MA courses, like multimodal discourse or even pedagogy, I have a lot of international students coming from Kazakhstan, Iran, Palestine, China, Japan, all in the same group. I have 16 students from very different backgrounds. And I understand how the Hungarian students work because I know where they come from. I know what they experience, but especially with like MA students, when they already accomplished the BA level their BA level studies, and they come from all over the world, it would be so good to see what was valuable to them, what their teachers valued, and because that's how they were somehow cultivated even implicitly, So I'm just wondering, has anyone, do you do any initial work on understanding how they think? Because I think I should be doing that, because then it would be easier to engage with them, all through the course.
Yeah.
I don't know how to do this. If anyone has any advice on this.
Well, before anyone jumps in, that would have been great for this study to then continue and investigate a bit more. All I did was just as an intervention, we had a chat in class about it. So they talked about their schooling experience. That yes would be great to follow up with within a scholarship project, and then to really get more details. Yeah,
exactly. Now, when we find out or we have a plan, we should talk because that will make life easier for us, I think.